All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome aboard. Sorry for the delay, technical issues. Um, we're all at the mercy of technology. Welcome aboard. Tonight, our interview with George McKeon with his new book. Um, wow, I'm off to a great start today. The Mystery of D.B. Cooper, a true crime adult coloring book. George McKeon is an artist and a graphic designer with over 30 years of experience in book publishing. And of course, as previously stated, he's the author of the new book, The Mystery of D.B. Cooper, a true crime adult coloring book. His website, check it out, georgemckeondesign.com. I will put the link to his book in the description. Also, note that his book is available at barnesandnoble.com or bn.com, and it is also available at independent bookstores everywhere. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome George McKeon. George, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
Before we get into it, tell us a little bit about yourself. And I also want to know, being in graphic design for so long, how has the advancement of technology affected your livelihood?
Well, I'm in one of those businesses where it's in most cases that it's actually helped with the ability to work remotely. Early in my career, I worked in New York City, and I lived north of New York City, so we're talking about a 4-hour commute every day, 2 hours each way. And there really was no other choice, just because the technology just did not exist to do my job remotely. So especially just within the last 5 years or so, and now of course, the last 18 months with COVID, where it seems like anyone who can work remotely is working remotely. It's been a benefit to me and to people like me. Of course, I do miss the interaction. I miss the collaboration that I think is important for my kind of work, but it certainly hasn't slowed. It certainly hasn't slowed me down. I've had the luxury of being able to work remotely, whereas a lot of people I know just don't have that luxury. So I do appreciate it.
That's great. And you wrote the book, and then your illustrator, that's, I don't want to say the last name wrong, but Reza.
It Yeah, don't even attempt to don't even attempt to do his last name. Yeah, he's a very talented artist that I do have illustration skills, but not at the level that I needed for this book, because I needed to, you know, do illustrations of people and airplanes and different sorts of vehicles and lots of interesting things going on. So I needed someone who could really sort of capture the whole event, and that's why I was lucky enough to work with an extremely talented illustrator. Again, his first name is Reza, and I won't attempt but he does have a credit in the book. And if anyone would like to hire him as an illustrator, he's fantastic, and I couldn't recommend him highly enough.
Yeah, I saw he had a few other credits on Amazon as well. As highly talented. I was
He's
super impressed.
outstanding, outstanding.
Let me ask you this: when you're doing something like this, and for those, I should have given a proper at the beginning of the show. It's an adult coloring book, and that's something to me that I didn't know existed until about 18 months ago. I have a family member who's very big into it. I saw it on her coffee table, and I kind of started doing the research into adult coloring books. I guess they tried to in the 60s and 70s. It was kind of a thing, but it really, I guess, within the last decade is when it really took off.
Yeah, and actually, since just within again the last 18 months since COVID and the quarantine and lockdown and so forth, and not only that, um, these I don't know if you've ever you mentioned you didn't have much experience with them, and I didn't either up until probably about a year and a half ago or so, and because I just thought they're silly, they're for kids, and I'm a grown man, and what am I doing with this thing? But I have to tell you, if you for people who've actually used them, the the therapeutic value of them is really it's legitimate. It really is. If you sit down with one of these things and you sit just for a few hours, you will feel your heart rate slow down. the stress levels decrease, and it's just a way of sort of taking an hour or two or however much spare time you happen to have. And like I said, the therapeutic value can't be underestimated for these things.
Absolutely, and that's what she does it for. It's very therapeutic for her, and it's also this book make it such a great coffee table book or to have on your desk. Everybody's there's still many people still at home Zoom, and to have on your desk when you're in that 4 hour meeting talking about fiscal year, quarter number two,
That's
and
right. That's
somebody's
right.
blabbing away, just something to zen to bring
Right.
things down. But it's beautifully illustrated. How do you, when you have one person who's kind of writing the story, one person who's drawing the picture, is it both of you guys working together as a collaboration, or is this you saying this is kind of what I want to go with this text?
Yeah, it's a lot of back and forth. And so what I did was I did sort of a broad outline. Um, I kind of gave myself, because when you do these sorts of projects, you kind of have to, first of all, give yourself a budget. And then you kind of work from there and see how many pages you can get out of that budget. And you draw up an outline and a story. And so I kind of came up with these parameters, and I did a rough outline and decided which parts of the stories made the most sense to be illustrated to sort of push the story along. And so then I worked again. I gathered up as much information as I could. If you notice, there's a lot of detail in the
Yeah.
illustrations, and so it required lots of research. And again, working with the illustrator, a lot of times things weren't quite right, and so it required some a little back and forth and some redos of certain things, because I wanted this to be as accurate as possible. Now that said, because of the nature and the format of this book, there had to be some there had to be some creative license, because after all, I mean, uh, the whole idea of this book is to make it as visually interesting as possible. So, but I did try to be accurate as much as possible, with a few exceptions.
Yeah, it's beautifully done. And is this something, the DB Cooper story, is this something that you've been fascinated with your entire life? Or, I mean, what made you choose DB Cooper?
Well, a lot of for people my age, I think I first became aware of the story back in the 70s. I don't know if any of your audience remembers, but the old show In Search Of,
Oh,
hosted
that's
by
right.
Leonard
Yeah.
Nimoy.
Leonard
I think that
Nimoy.
was one
Yep.
of the first. Yeah, I think that was one of the first shows I saw this story, and this probably was at that time. It was probably only about maybe 5 years after the actual event, and there was just something about the story that captured my imagination. I think it was the iconic police sketch, and just the just the mystery around this case. That who was this guy? What happened to him? Why did he do it? Where did he go? Did he survive? Where's the money? All these questions, come to mind. And then, because of my long history in publishing over the years, I mean, I've probably worked on, I don't know, over 1,000 books probably. And through the years, I worked on a few sort of compilations of, true mystery kind of books. And all the usual suspects would be in there, Bermuda Triangle, um,
Right.
then of course D.B. Cooper and some of the other Bigfoot, that's that sort of thing. And so I would always kind of come back to the D.B. Cooper story, and it sort of never lost its appeal to me, because again, we're going on 50 years,
Yeah.
and after 50 years, they really don't know anything more than they knew 45 years ago, and there's just something about the mystery that just has a hold of me.
And if I'm not mistaken, didn't the FBI officially put this whole thing to bed like 2017?
Yeah, 2016. It was 2016 was the 45th anniversary, and they pretty much sort of threw up their arms and said, "Look, they really hadn't received any new information, any new leads, and I guess they made a determination that their resources could be better utilized in other places, and so they basically put the case on hold, and I guess reassigned agents to other more pressing cases."
Yeah, I mean, I assumed he was about 30 at the time, so I mean, they would have been chasing at least an 80-year-old guy at the time, and that
Right.
depends on who you're talking about. The first suspect, if you will, I think you have them listed separately in your book as well. Richard McCoy,
Yes. Richard
one of
McCoy.
the first one.
He,
What are your thoughts on him?
well, I mean, of all the suspects, he's my favorite. And I'll tell you, there's a few. I'll give you a few reasons why I think he may have been DB Cooper, and then I'll give you a few reasons why I don't think he was DB Cooper. Okay, well, number one, he was a Green Beret. He was a helicopter pilot. So he certainly had the skills, and not only that, he pulled off a copycat crime a few months after this original case, where he succeeded.
Yeah,
Um, Now the difference is, this time he actually he wore a helmet. He brought a helmet with him. He actually brought his own parachute with him. He asked for $500,000 in $100 bills, as opposed to the first hijacking, which was $200,000 in $20 bills. Again, he was successful in that he landed safely, but he was shortly apprehended, and then actually eventually he was sentenced to 45 years in prison. But this guy, he broke out of prison. He escaped. There was a manhunt, and after time, they eventually tracked him down, and he was eventually killed in a police shootout with
yeah.
federal agents. So he certainly had the tools. He certainly had the abilities to pull off something like this. Now, there's a few reasons why maybe he wasn't. In that, everyone who saw this man, DB Cooper, Dan Cooper, of course, is how he identified himself, said he was between 40 to 45 years old, 5'10" to 6 feet tall, somewhere around 175 pounds. Now, they also said he had olive skin and brown eyes. Of course, eventually he put sunglasses on, but that's how people pretty much on board the plane who saw this man, that's how they identified him. Now, Richard McCoy, he had blue eyes, actually very light blue eyes. He did not have olive complexion. And at the time, he was only 29 years old. Now, I suppose it's possible that you can confuse a 29-year-old for someone in their mid 40s. I mean, he did have like a high sort of hairline. So I guess that's possible. But he also had very prominent ears. If you've ever seen
Yes.
pictures of him, I, I would I would think that a lot of people would mention that. I think typically what you're going to do is you're going to want to mention prominent features, like they had, a big nose, or any sort of distinguishing features, a scar, obviously facial hair of some sort. And I would think that large ears that sort of stick out would also be one of those distinguishing features, but those were never mentioned. So, like I said, he certainly could have done it. He certainly had the. He did do it. He did the similar crime, and maybe not in the exact same circumstances, but he hijacked a plane, asked for ransom, jumped out of the back of the. It was also a 727 Boeing 727 with aft stairs, and he made it. Of course, he was eventually apprehended and sent to prison. But so of all my research and all the suspects I've seen, to me personally, he comes the closest to possibly being DB Cooper.
I agree, and with the ears very prominent, and his military awards blew me away. With the first time I looked him up, he won the Distinguished Flying Cross.
Absolutely, he's a real badass.
Yeah, absolutely. He got a Purple Heart in
Right.
Vietnam, so this guy was legit a legit badass. And I mean, you hijack two planes and escape from prison. That's a heck of a career.
Now, here's one other thing I forgot to mention. So Richard McCoy was a Mormon. He was
Oh, is
actually
that right?
also a student at Brigham Young University, and he did not smoke and he did not drink. And of course, famously, DB Cooper, ordered
Bourbon
bourbon.
and a Coke and smoked cigarettes, right?
He smoked at least 6 cigarettes. So that's another. I mean, could he still have done it? Maybe a way to throw off throw
Sure.
people off the scent. Yeah, that's possible, but I don't know. I don't know. That seems unlikely, in my opinion.
Very interesting. That's an interesting tidbit to ponder. Um, Number two, Kenneth Peter Christensen. What's your thoughts on him?
Well, he's an interesting one too. Now, he was he was a World War II veteran as well. He had paratrooper training. Now, from what I understand, he never saw action, but he did do lots. He did do a lot of training jumps because he this was towards the end of World War II as things were sort of winding down.
Right.
But he did have the ability, as a paratrooper and experience. He eventually got a job at Northwest Airlines, actually Northwest Orient, as it was known back then, the same airline that was hijacked, as a purser, and he worked there for many years. If you look online and you look at there's a photo of him online in his uniform, in his purser uniform as a Northwest Orient employee. If you look at his face, to me, he looks the most like the original DB Cooper sketch, which a lot of people call the Bing Crosby sketch, in that he sort of has a Bing Crosby, like maybe it's the shape of his head or something. But my feeling about him is that based on everything I've read, he seemed like a very mild mannered guy, and I can't imagine someone that worked for that airline for that many years would risk being possibly recognized by
Absolutely.
another employee. Now, he did do mostly international flights, and of course, this was a domestic flight that was hijacked. But I don't know. I don't. I'm not. I don't know why. It seems to me to be a very risky move. Now, it's also said that when he died, one of the things. So he had a brother, and one of the last things he said to his brother was, I have something I have something to tell you, but I can't." And of course, he never told his brother. And of course, there's speculation that he was going to confess to being DB
Yep.
Cooper, but he didn't. And now he also left something like over $200,000 when he died. Now, from what again my research says that that money was actually from some property that he sold around shortly before he passed away, and was not connected to the hijacking. So while, again, in my opinion, he's a really interesting character, but and while I think he probably looks the most like the sketch, I don't, I don't think he was DB Cooper.
Yeah, the things that when I was researching it, when I did the podcast several months ago, a couple of things I remember was he was a smoker.
Right, and
He
he did
was a
love
bourbon.
bourbon.
Yep, he was a bourbon drinker, and he was left-handed,
Right,
which they say evidence shows that he was left-handed. We don't know that for sure, but
right.
they say it is. And then, of course, with his brother, there's something, that's just kind of weird. There's something I got to tell you, but I can't. I mean, if you're on your deathbed, wouldn't you just say it?
Yeah, exactly. What is he? Why is he holding back now?
Yeah, I mean, and then that brings us to our now. If he worked with the airlines, what if there's a correlation between what we talked about earlier? Maybe he was in on it with the other people on the plane.
Well, one of the things that so when DB, let's just say, yeah, okay. So when DB Cooper first handed the note to the flight attendant, he asked her to sit next to him, and of
Mm-hmm.
course she sort of acted as a liaison between between DB Cooper and the pilots, who then radioed ahead to Seattle with his demands. At one point, she asked him, "Do you have a grudge with Northwest Airlines?" And he said, "I don't have a grudge with Northwest Airlines. I just have a grudge."
Hmm.
So again, to me, if Christensen, if he's an employee of Northwest Airlines, um, why is he doing this? I mean, I would have to think that maybe if someone was laid off or something, or they somehow wronged him. But anyway, that's another reason why I don't think Christensen was DB Cooper. Okay, so your
Makes
other
sense.
question was, yeah, so there is a theory out there that that there never was. The reason they never found DB Cooper, the reason they never found any of his parachute or a body or anything like that, is because there never was a DB Cooper, and that he he didn't exist, and that the crew somehow conspired to pull off this whole event. Um, I should. I mean, that is a really interesting idea, and it's a really interesting conspiracy.
Indeed.
But again, based on my um, research, there's absolutely no evidence that this is the case. I mean, number one, um, at that time, now we're talking 1971. Now this is kind of more like the tail end of sort of the golden age of of airlines, where
Yep.
this was a really prestigious job to not only be a pilot, but to be a flight attendant. These were really sought after positions. This was seen as being very glamorous. It's not like it is today, where these flight attendants have to deal with these people and they end up duct taping them to the seat and that sort of thing. So this was a really glamorous, prestigious job.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so, and again, well, $200,000 back in 1971 is somewhere around 1.2, $1.3 million.
Yep.
That's a lot of money, but this would require the entire crew to be obviously be involved in this. And I think at its height, I think I don't know, is there 7 or 8 people in the crew?
Yeah, you're not going to do it for
Yeah,
$25,000, $30,000, I
I mean, you're
guess.
dividing this right 7 or 8 ways, plus just the risk. I mean, we're talking, you're going to jail probably for the rest of your life for something like this. It just doesn't. I don't know. And not only that, all of these, or not all, but most of these people remained with the airline for many, many years afterwards. And again, there was really never any kind of strong evidence to suggest that there was any sort of conspiracy with the crew. Like I said, it really is an interesting idea, but there's no evidence whatsoever.
Agreed. We're talking with George McKeon and his new book, The Mystery of D.B. Cooper, a true crime adult coloring book. Let's move along to our third character under the microscope. That would be Robert Rackstraw.
Okay, now he's a real character. I've always thought that whoever this was, they had to have at least some sort, if not a criminal background, someone who was involved at least in some similar operations. Now, if anyone has ever done any research on Robert Rackstro, this is a very colorful guy. Again, he was also a veteran. He was
Yep.
also a pilot, Vietnam War pilot. Um, he he got involved in lots of stuff over the years. I mean, he faked his own death at one point. He did some freelance after he was discharged from the army. He actually did some freelance sort of soldier of fortune operation. So he was a real character. He also, I'm trying to remember. I think maybe you could help me on this one. Didn't he? He was accused of killing his father-in-law. I forgot what it was.
Yeah, I think right in the 70s time frames, records show that former Army helicopter pilot was charged with the murder of his stepfather in the 70s and with forging checks with the
Yeah.
victim's signature.
So he had a long criminal history. So I see that sort of as as a strength in that I never thought that whoever did this was a guy who a lot of people thought, well, maybe he was a Boeing engineer, because around that time, I think a year or so before this happened, Boeing laid off about a third of their workforce, and we're talking like
Yep,
thousands of people. And
absolutely.
at that time, in that part of the country, Seattle was one of those company towns, and so if you're, when they lay off a large portion of their workforce, it
It
has a
affects
ripple
everybody.
effect. Yeah, exactly. And so some people suggested maybe it was a disgruntled Boeing engineer who decided to take this on. And maybe it was if this engineer at the same time had a some sort of military background and maybe some paratrooper training of some sort. But I don't know. From all accounts, DB Cooper was calm, cool, and collected.
Yeah.
And I would think the average person who is taking on something like this, who maybe, who's never done something like this before, um, I can't imagine a more stressful situation because you're not only risking being captured by police or possibly, killed by police, spending the rest of your life in prison, but you're also, of course, there's also the idea of being killed while trying to attempt to jump, or
Right. Just the danger involved in
just
jumping out of
yeah,
a moving airplane.
it's a really highly stressful situation. And again, according to all accounts, DB Cooper was calm, cool, collected, and not only that, he was polite, well spoken, and by all accounts, and I mean, of course, he was threatening. He was threatening to blow up a plane, but in the nicest way possible. It's interesting. I just one of the flight attendants, Tina Mucklow, she was the one who spent the most time with Cooper on the
Mm-hmm.
plane. And in fact, she was the only flight attendant left, other than um, the flight crew, the pilot, co-pilot, and so forth. She was the only one left on the plane when they took off and before he jumped. And one of the things she said one of the last things she said to him as she was heading towards the cockpit to join the crew, she said, "Can you please take the bomb with you? Can you please take the bomb with you when you leave?" And of course, he did do that. Now, whether or not he did it, he was planning to do it all along. I guess we'll really never know. But it's interesting that she did ask him to please take it with you, and he did. And if you think about it, he had a lot to carry. I mean, he already had uh, a large amount of cash to bring with him, and he was very careful though. He made sure to take the notes that he wrote and handed to the flight attendant. He took the bomb with him. The only thing he left behind, of course, were 6 cigarette butts, and of course back then the DNA was in its infancy, so
Right.
I don't think anyone really thought of that as evidence. And actually, eventually, that those cigarette butts disappeared from the FBI's evidence.
No
No
kidding.
one knows where they are, or where they went. I
Yeah.
don't know.
And
I don't know if they could at this point still extract DNA. I mean, I don't know enough about it, but I would think out of everything, I would have to think that was the strongest candidate for DNA extraction. They did find some
absolutely.
DNA on a tie, also left behind the clip-on tie, but a lot of people believe that it's there's a, they're not even sure. They're not even 100% sure that it was his tie, although they're pretty sure. But at the same time, it could have been a tie that was picked up at a thrift store or something, or who knows. And not only that, over the years, just from the handling and so forth, it's probably been so contaminated that any real evidence being extracted is very unlikely.
Yeah. We used to do a podcast with unsolved murders, and my great uncle was murdered in 1989, and
Oh,
we met a couple years ago, maybe a year and a half, with because it's a cold case to this day,
wow.
and I think they were saying late 80s, early 90s is when the actual DNA. Because he said he remembered having his partner having to fly to San Francisco because it's not like every state, every city had a place where they could do the DNA runs.
Right.
And he said even back from 89, it would be maybe 50-50. So from 72, I mean, who knows? You might get lucky. But when I hear things like the 6 cigarette butts mysteriously disappeared, that's when I start to think the other theory that you had in mind was, what if none of this really happened and it was all just to get security more beefed up at the airports?
Right. One of the other theories is that around this time, again, this was November of 1971. So between 1968 and 1972, there were more than 130 hijackings. Most of them were to usually people who wanted to go to Cuba. I mean,
Hmm.
it's kind of like the cliche, but it's true.
Yeah.
And So the airline's policy at that time was pretty much just complete capitulation. They just give them what they want, whatever they want, just give it to them. Give them any amount of money they want. Take them wherever they want to go. We don't want any trouble. We want things to stay business as usual. And of course, they didn't want anyone hurt, obviously either. Um, now, so I think what happened was this was probably very frustrating for at the federal level, that these hijackings were happening and the airlines weren't really taking any sort of stand or doing anything to decrease the frequency of these hijackings. So there are some theories out there that say this whole operation, that D.D. Cooper was a some sort of intelligence agent of some sort, and that and that's why it was done so professionally, that no one was hurt, that there wasn't any violence. Again, I don't want to glamorize this too much. I mean, it was a criminal act, but
Right.
it went. All things considered, it went about as well as something like this could go. In that, again, no one was hurt, there was no violence, and the only one who really was at the most risk was D.D. Cooper himself, obviously. And so this was all an attempt to sort of force the airline's hand and get them to really take this seriously and increase airport security and get on board with the government's efforts to push forward legislation for increased airport security.
Yeah, because there's got to be a fine line between these airlines wanting more security, but with more security comes what? More expenses. Who's going to pay for that? So
Right.
again, who benefited from this? Did the airlines maybe plan this story to have the government get involved in security, or was it vice versa? The government did it to put pressure on the airlines. It's a great question, and it's a great theory.
It is a great question, because you're right. I mean, on one hand, you would think that the airlines would want to have increased security, because that they could even market that to their passengers and say, well, we have increased security. We're keeping your safety in mind, and we care about you, that sort of thing. But as far again, according to my research, I didn't see any evidence of the airlines lobbying anyone to say, listen, we really need increased security. I think they were perfectly happy. And I should mention that in the vast majority of these cases of the hijackings that I mentioned earlier, there was never, no one was ever hurt or killed. I mean, maybe I could be wrong on that one, but the vast majority were nonviolent episodes.
Yeah, very few. You're right. Most of them were. Very rarely did anybody get hurt or killed.
Right.
But you're right. This was almost like something written by Albert Broccoli, like a James Bond. Everything was, the guy who was dressed up to a T.
Right.
He had his bourbon, his cigarettes. I mean, when you sit back and think about it, you're like, this is. It was too perfect almost to be real.
Yeah, I think that's part of the appeal of this whole story, is that because it has kind of a Hollywood
Yep.
blockbuster feel about it. In that, and again, if you didn't know anything about the story, and you saw a movie where something like this happened, you probably wouldn't believe it. You'd say, oh, that's just Hollywood, and that could never really happen. But it did. It really did happen.
Yeah, and that kind of reminds me of the whole "Catch Me If You Can" with
Right.
the Pan Am Airlines and
Exactly. And I
forging
think there's
checks.
there's certainly a feeling with a lot of people that he got something over on maybe corporations, meaning the airlines, and of course the banks for the money, and the government and so forth. So they're there for some people. There is that element that he's sort of an anti-hero feeling to the whole episode, and I think that's appealing to a lot of people.
So, and you had mentioned, how did the money get to Tinabar?
Well, that's a great question. That's a really great question. For I don't know how much your audience knows about the story, but um, so I think in 1980, so they were talking 9 years
Yeah.
after this episode. There's a family, and they're on there. It's a sandy sort of bar along. It's on the north part of the Columbia River, and they're having a little, picnic. And the father tells his son, I think he's about 9 years old. He says, "Hey, dig a little fire pit so we can start cooking." And the young boy, he kind of just digs a very shallow pit, and he finds three bundles of this money. Now it's very degraded. It's most of it is is barely recognizable as money. But they bring this money to the authorities, and they look it over. And some of the bills they're able to you can still see the serial numbers on some of these bills. Now, when the money for DB Cooper was gathered, now there's two different stories. I should mention that there's two different stories as to um, the gathering of this money. One story says that the FBI took had a microfilm and took photos of each and every bill, recording the serial number on each and every bill.
Right.
Now, there's another story that says that this money was put aside, like a lot of banks, and especially a bank in Seattle, because again, Northwest was I believe is based out of Seattle. They had money already put aside for such an occasion. They had, and from what I understand, it was $250,000, and so it was already put aside, and the bills, the serial numbers were already pre-recorded, so that it was sort of ready to go. Now, which is the true story? I don't know, because again, it depends on which source you believe. And so anyway, but the point is, the serial numbers on each and every bill that were handed over as part of the ransom were recorded, and then were able to be traced to this money at Tinabar. Now, how it got there, I don't know, because if you believe there's a certain flight path that a lot of people that was developed. Now, this was based on um, air traffic control records, flight transcripts, um, you know, um, and also the flight recorder on this plane. So they sort of cobbled together all this information to determine the actual flight path of this, the 727. This money was found way outside of that flight path.
Yes.
So how it got there, I don't know. Now, I don't know how much you want to get into this, because you could, there's a lot of theories about they've done tests on this money. And so there's this guy. His name is Tom Kay, and I think I know you're familiar with him.
Mm-hmm.
He's sort of like the scientist in charge of the citizen sleuths
Yep.
portion of this story, and he's a really really smart guy.
Indeed.
He did some tests. The FBI gave him some of this money and said, "Hey, go ahead, do some tests on it, see what you can find out." So he did some tests, and he apparently there are these things called diatoms. I think I'm saying it. I hope I'm saying it properly. And so they're like these microscopic organisms that live in
Certain areas.
certain areas,
Yeah.
certain bodies of water. And so by studying these bills, he determined that this particular species of diatoms only live in like in the spring time in these particular bodies of water. So
That's right.
his conclusion was that this money was probably put there sometime in the spring. Now, of course, this hijacking happened in November.
Yep.
So there's a question of, okay, so where was this money between November and the springtime? So, I mean, if I had to guess, I would think that whoever buried this money, he probably buried some of it there, and probably buried it in 10 different places. It's possible that maybe he forgot about this money, or he just lost it and couldn't remember where he buried it. I don't know. My answer to you is I don't know. I wish I did. But it really is fascinating because it's really the only piece of evidence that says that at least this money made it to the ground and is not stuck up in a tree somewhere with a with a skeleton. 50 years later, this money made it to the ground. How it made it to the ground, how it made it there, I don't know.
And what was the figure that's been accounted for to this date? Is it like 6 or 8,000 of the 200?
I think it was $5,800 was the
Oh,
amount.
okay.
It was in three stacks. Now, um, again, these, from what I understand, and again, I could be wrong because there's a lot of conflicting information out there, but apparently these were bundled together when the bank handed over the money. They were in, I guess, what's called packets, and that's so. If you've ever seen a big stack of bills from a bank, they put like a paper, sort of like a paper ribbon around it,
Yep.
to hold all the money together. Now these had rubber bands around them, and while the rubber bands were certainly degraded, they were holding up enough to keep this money together. I mean, I don't know, I'm not a rubber band expert, but I can't imagine that rubber bands, after 9 years exposed to the elements, are still, strong enough to keep a bundle of cash together. So I guess that's another possible piece of evidence that maybe the money was somewhere else and then moved to that location. Again, I don't know, but it's really fascinating to think about.
As far as the ransom money never being discovered in circulation, could that possibly lend a little credit to Rackstraw? Because remember, after the whole he may have murdered his father-in-law and all that craziness he actually went to Iran to train the
Yes,
fighters over there in the 70s.
that's right.
Iran doesn't have a central bank, so those American dollars would pretty much go untraced. Well, I mean, I don't know how often that money leaves over there, but that's a thought.
No, it's definitely a thought. And again, I think the main reason that the FBI discounted Rackstraw was mainly based to uh, the description. He was only 27 years old at the time.
Right.
Again, I think he had blue eyes. I'm not sure exactly what his height was. He was probably around the right height. But again, I don't think he had olive skin. So I think it mainly had to do with the fact that he just didn't quite. Oh, and also, uh, I know Tina Mucklow, or maybe I know she did, but maybe both Tina Mucklow and Florence Schaffner. They're the two flight attendants who had the most contact with Cooper. Neither of them really. They neither said that he. They don't remember him looking like Robert Rackstraw. For what that's worth. You can say, oh, well, maybe under a stressful situation, or your memory fails over time, but that's what they say.
Sure, you got to take their word for it.
Yeah, you have to.
Absolutely.
But he is a really colorful character, and again, to me, the two guys who certainly had all the tools to do this, Richard McCoy and Robert Rackstraw. Again,
Yeah,
they had the means, they had the motive, and they certainly had the skill set to make this happen. Because,
absolutely.
and again, McCoy did make it happen. But again, the biggest discount. Well, McCoy actually, he had the interesting thing about McCoy is, so even after he was uh, captured and convicted for the second hijacking, and again, he got 45 years. I guess I have to say to myself, well, then why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't he just admit to the first one too? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure why he wouldn't do that, because why not? But he never confessed to it. And of course, Rackstraw, he sort of hinted around that he may have been, but he of course never, you know, officially uh, fessed up to being D.B. Cooper.
And to be fair, there's people out there who just like the attention. So he could have well known not been him, and him just to leave that stuff out there to have the attention on him.
There have been more than one, deathbed confession over the years, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think hundreds is probably a conservative estimate.
Two things I always found weird about this whole thing. Number one, just strategically, this happened the night before Thanksgiving, correct?
That's correct.
It isn't generally the night before Thanksgiving one of the busiest times to travel.
Well, I don't know if it, I know certainly it is now. Whether it was back then, I'm not sure. Now, um, that's true, but on the other hand, I always thought it was a really brilliant time to do it because if you're committing a crime the day before a holiday, the day before, in this case, the day before Thanksgiving, the next day is Thanksgiving. No one is paying attention to the news. No one's, everyone's involved in what's going on Thanksgiving. No one is watching the newscasts or looking at the newspaper. It's a holiday, so in a way, so you have at least one day sort of head start before they can get the news out. To really spread the news out where people are actually paying attention. So in a way, it's kind of a really interesting timing to commit a crime like that.
Yeah, that is true. And then you have a lot of people on vacation, the backup people handling things because people
Right.
with tenure taking time off because it is a vacation time.
That's
That
right.
is true. But also, who wants to jump out of a plane in November
I don't know.
in Seattle? I mean, it had to be 40 degrees at least, and it's always rainy, cold, wet. That would be what a hell of a time to jump.
Well, it's interesting because on one hand, he did a lot of things right, and he made a lot of really smart moves. For instance, again, he was very careful about the evidence. He he took the note with him. He took the bomb with him. He took again. He left behind the cigarette butts, but and the tie. I don't know how intentional that was or not, but and he if maybe many people don't know, he gave very specific instructions to the pilots because he obviously wasn't going to jump out of a plane um, going full speed
Right.
because I don't know exactly what these planes, how fast they were, but I have to think 400 miles an hour. So he gave very specific instructions in that he wanted them to fly at no higher than 10,000 feet so that the cabin didn't have to be pressurized because if the cabin were pressurized and you opened the door, of course,
That's big
anything that was
problems.
going to be sucked out of the plane.
Yeah.
He also asked the pilots to put the landing gear down and also to tip the flaps at 15 degrees. Basically, fly this thing as slow as possible without stalling to make
Right.
his chances of jumping out of the back of this thing. Now, again, we're talking 1971, and nowadays, if you want to find out anything about anything, obviously you jump on Google, and in 5 minutes, you have this information. In 1971, um, you know, information like this was hard to find. I mean, unless you were either in the airline industry, either as a pilot or a mechanic or or something. So there obviously had to be some familiarity. You have to be familiar with the plane or this sort of operation. So he did a lot of things right, like I said. But the strange thing is he didn't ask for a specific flight path. He just said to them, he originally said he was going to go to Mexico City.
Right.
Of course, he never had any intentions of going to Mexico City, but that's where he said he wanted to go. And he didn't give them a flight path. They even asked them. They said, "Okay, well, what's your flight path?" And he basically said, "Well, whatever wherever you want to go." So I guess that eliminates the idea that he certainly had maybe a co-conspirator because if he doesn't know exactly where he's jumping, then he's obviously no one can meet him there to pick him up.
That's
So
right.
that was very interesting in that he didn't. He basically just said he left it up to them, and when he exactly jumped was, I think, completely random based on all the evidence because he had a little trouble getting the stairs. They're called aft stairs,
Hmm.
which are like stairs that come out of the belly of the plane, and it's for the Boeing 727, and these planes were designed for airports with maybe smaller size airports that maybe don't have gates or terminal or something, and it would allow people to deplane right on the tarmac. But of course, at the same time, it came in handy for just such an occasion for someone to jump out of the bottom of this plane. So it's really interesting. And again, he really obviously he wasn't prepared in that he didn't bring a helmet. He was wearing a business suit and loafers. And you're right. I mean, he probably couldn't have picked a worse night to go to jump. There was a really terrible storm with rain and heavy cloud cover, and he probably didn't see where he was until I don't know. They were above the clouds, so he jumped into clouds, and once he came out of the clouds, he he really there's no way he could have known where he was until he got obviously much closer to the ground. So it's really very interesting. It's a that he seemed to on one hand plan this very carefully, and on the other hand he left some things up to chance. It
Yeah,
seems.
he didn't have the greatest exit strategy because
No,
remember, this is pre GPS. You couldn't pull out a cell phone and bring up your map and see where you were. He had no
that's
idea where
true.
he was when he landed.
Now, to be fair, there was a delay. So when he first gave his demands, he demands were $200,000 in cash. He wanted four parachutes,
Right,
and
which
then
was smart.
right, right. He asked for four parachutes, so he asked for two primary and then two backup.
Yeah,
And a lot of people say, well, why did he do that? And no one knows for sure, of course. But one of the theories is that, um, first of all, I'm sure he maybe thought that they would try and tamper with one of the
absolutely. Yeah,
parachutes. But then another theory is that he wanted it to seem like he was going to take a hostage with him, and therefore they wouldn't tamper with the parachutes for sure. They wouldn't want to mess with any of these parachutes. Um, and yet somehow, this is one of the things I've always been surprised about. But so there's the two main parachutes. One was a military parachute, and one was a civilian sports style parachute. Um, Now he chose the military parachute. Now some people say that's because he didn't have, he really didn't have a lot of experience with parachutes, and he just randomly grabbed one of them, not knowing really the difference between the two. But if you're maybe a veteran of World War II, and if he was around mid 40s, he was around the right age to be a veteran of World War II with paratrooper experience. It's not too unlikely that maybe he would choose something that he was more familiar with, which would be like a military style parachute as opposed to a civilian parachute.
right.
And as far as the two backup parachutes, those are the ones you keep on your chest in case the main parachute malfunctions. One of them was a dummy chute, um, and I guess used for training. Now, how that dummy chute ended up there, I don't know, because I'm not sure how if they thought that he possibly was going to take a hostage.
Why would
How
they
is a
do that?
mistake like that made? Right? I
Yes.
mean, so to me that says that if someone at a skydiving school makes a mistake like that, someone who deals with parachutes all day every day, then isn't it possible that even someone with experience could also make that same mistake? So I kind of discount that as a reason for him being, um, and more than likely anyway, from everything I've heard, he didn't even use it as a parachute anyway. The one that he brought, he most likely used it as a to carry other things in there. Because again, he did jump with the suit, his attaché case as well. So maybe that's where he stuck it out. Of course, we don't know.
That makes sense. If you believe the narrative as it's presented to us, do you think it is something he did completely by himself, or do you think he had help on the ground or any help with planning?
I don't. That's a great question. Um, I don't know because the interesting thing about this case is that all we really know about this guy is when he's on this plane. We don't really know where he came from. We don't know. There was no. This was a time where there's no airport security. I mean, did he drive there? was he driven? Did he take a cab there? I mean, did someone drive him there and drop him off? We just don't know. I don't know. It seems to me that an operation like this, if I had to guess, I'd have to think he had some sort of uh, co-conspirator of
Yeah,
some
agreed.
sort. Because you know, again, who's gonna pick him up from the wherever he lands? I don't know. But again, these are pre-GPS days. They're the pre-cell phone days. So how you arrange something like that at that time is beyond me. I don't
Yeah,
know.
he would have had to make his way to a payphone and call a random person and tell him where he's at. Because just to think you would jump out of a plane with 200K, hit the ground, and then just go about your way. I mean, that is, I'm not sure that's something that he would pull off by himself, but I think this is going to be one of those stories that will just it is meant to be never solved.
I think you're right. I think to me, that's part of the appeal of this
Yeah,
case. I mean, I think more than likely that if by some miracle we do find out, I think we would probably be disappointed
yeah,
in in the actual story and who this person was. I think, and actually, that's part of the in the book there. The one of the things is you can. I think one of the appeals of this case is you can kind of imagine, you can kind of write the story yourself because there's really no evidence that can prove that your theories are wrong because all we really know are very few things and whether or not he made it or didn't make it or who he was. Even the police sketches are so kind of generic that you can kind of project who. I mean, at that time, most men looked like that at that time.
yeah, oh, yeah.
Middle-aged guys, they had the same haircut. They kind of they
Back
were
then,
like,
everybody wore suits and ties when they traveled. That was
right,
not out of the ordinary. Not like
exactly. It
today,
was a
where
very
everybody gets on
glamorous.
in their leisure suits.
You're exactly right. No one was in their pajamas on the planes back then.
Yep.
People dressed, because it was a very. It wasn't like today where it's more like it's like a bus in the sky. This was like a very glamorous, prestigious thing.
Absolutely. So, with everything that you've sorted over in your research for the book, if you had gun to your head one solution, who do you think it is?
I well, okay. If I gun to my head, I would say Richard McCoy, gun to my head.
Yeah,
Even though there are
I think
still
most
some,
people would say that as well.
yeah, just because of again, there are 10 reasons why he could have been DB Cooper, and then there are 10 reasons why he couldn't. But of all the suspects I've seen, he's as strong or stronger than any of them.
Because it is pretty odd somebody who is of his beliefs to be smoking and drinking, but then again, he could have done it, like you said, to throw people off.
Well, it's interesting because you say, well, I don't smoke or drink, but I do hijack
Yeah,
planes.
you make a great point. I guess if you're going to sin, you might as well do it all. Go out
Exactly,
with a bang, right?
exactly.
It's such a beautiful book. I hope everybody orders it. You've got great reviews on Amazon. It's amazing how you did this. I love how you skipped every other page
Yeah,
to make sure that you protected the other page. You were
that's
very
right.
thoughtful about everything.
I
You
did.
even talked about the Ingrams and the $5,800 that were found.
Yeah.
And then I'll show the back cover here, which is very beautiful as well. Hope I'm not going too fast. Everything is done so well. Um, do you have anything
Well, I
in
was going to
store
say,
for us next?
well, let me just say one more thing.
Sure, absolutely.
I think this is one of the really nice things about this book. I think is that e- even if you're not, if you're somewhat interested in this case, I think this is almost like a nice kind of way to start. In that it just gives the kind of like the broad strokes of the story. I mean, you could write 1,000-page book on this subject, but I feel like it's a more accessible way for more people, especially younger people, to sort of be introduced to this case. And like I said, at the same time, the idea, the therapeutic value of these coloring books are are really, especially in these in these times, for sure, are really very beneficial, and it's a way for people who to like literally you can fill in the blanks and color this story the way you want to.
Yeah, and my wife, when I showed her, she was really intrigued. That she said there was number one, it's thought provoking because of the story itself, and then it also gives you an outlet into coloring and presenting the story as an individual as well. It was just brilliantly done,
Thank you.
and congratulations. Wish you all the success. Do you have a follow up plan? Is there another theory out there that intrigues you that you're thinking of doing as a follow up to this?
I haven't done anything yet, but I one of the things I've been thinking about is I'm not sure how I'm going to do this, but is the whole Area 51 is something that's also always intrigued me. Of course, there's obviously very little information about this subject, but and how I'm able to pull this off, I'm not sure. But that's something I've always been fascinated with, and I think it's the most closely guarded, heavily guarded. I mean, other than maybe Fort Knox, it's one of the more highly guarded
It is.
facilities on the planet. So that was one idea, whether or not I actually do, but that's the idea I have at the moment.
That would be awesome, and that would be very interesting. And there are people out there. It's a shame Art Bell. He would have been an awesome person to talk about with that.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's amazing. Was there anything else you wanted to cover as far as conspiracy theories out there that intrigued you?
Um, I don't think I think we covered everything. Well, the only other thing, just very briefly, is
Of
that
course.
um, one of the things a lot of people think that D.D. Cooper was possibly ex-CIA. Of course, he was, by all accounts, in his mid-40s, and a lot of people made the connection that Air America, which I don't know how much your audience is familiar with what Air America was, but it was a passenger and cargo airline owned and operated by the CIA. Um, it was from, I think, the 50s up until somewhere around 1976. And so most of their operations were during the Vietnam War, where they would do, covert operations and support, and they would drop soldiers and also supplies and so forth. And they had something like 2 dozen twin engine aircrafts. They had at least a few 727s, which was the same air plane that D.D. Cooper dropped from. And some people believe that his experience, possibly in Air America, and knowing that this plane had you were able to not only drop uh, uh, supplies, but also people could jump out of the back of this plane. They've made that connection now. Of course, because we don't know who D.B. Cooper was, that's a hard connection to prove. But it
Absolutely.
certainly is. It certainly is interesting. And they also had over 300 pilots. So there was a large pool of people who had a lot of special skills. And I guess it's not out of the uh, realm of to think that he possibly could have been some sort of ex-intelligence officer. Now, what his grudge was, I don't know. I guess we'll never know. But it's kind of something very interesting to think about, because very few people knew that this plane, you were able to activate these stairs in flight and use this plane as a mechanism to jump from. In fact, the pilots had no idea. Some people at Boeing didn't even know. They actually had to contact some of the engineers who were involved with the creation of this plane to find out that, yes, as a matter of fact, you could use the stairs for these sorts of operations. So that's something I also thought was pretty interesting, and something to think about.
Wonder how covert, if that was the case, because the CIA was also involved in a lot of drug running
Yes,
in Vietnam in the '70s, and then of
that's right.
course the Tom not Tom Hanks, the Tom Cruise movie. Well, I guess that was Mena, Arkansas in the '80s. That whole mess.
Yeah,
The
you're
CIA
absolutely right.
is.
I'm sure more than one or two pallets of God knows what went out of the back of a 727 at that time.
Right, and the average Joe and Josephine off the street is not going to know that the aft stairs can have the
Absolutely not.
ability to come down during flight.
No. Again, this is pre-internet. This is where
Right.
you just, like I said, very few people knew about these sorts of things unless they were intimately involved in whatever, like I said, either a pilot or an engineer or um, maybe ex military or uh, you know intelligence officials.
Absolutely. The Amazon delivery person must be here. I apologize. It's really intriguing stuff, and you're right. It's one of those things. Let's keep the book open. That'll give us something when we sit around the fireplace to talk about and debate, and
Right.
everything about thought provocation is so important versus sitting in front of Netflix and watching the television tell you a story.
That's
I
right.
thoroughly enjoy sitting around and chewing the fat. And every time I talk to somebody about these type of things, I learn something new. And again, you're a fantastic interview, and
Thank you.
best of luck with the book. And folks, we'll put in the show description, we'll have all the links to his website. By the way, you have a wonderful website. You do a lot of great stuff. It looks like you do other book covers. And what else do you do?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a graphic designer. Yeah, so I do book covers, book design, and marketing, all sorts of things.
Yeah, so please go to his website. And again, folks, I'm down two screens, so I apologize. It's georgemckeondesign.com. Check out his website if you're looking for any graphic designs. We'll have the Amazon link to his book. You can also go to barnesandnobles.com. It's just so well done. And it's definitely one of those books that would be great to have on the coffee table to start a conversation. Is there anything else you would like to close with, sir?
I think we covered it all.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time, ladies and gentlemen. That's George McKeon.
Thank you.
Thanks.